Welcome to another episode of The Local Dive. This is Alex Scott, and I'm joined today by only Ashlyn Portero.
Hello.
How's it going?
Well, not solo, but...
Yeah, we're Deanless today. We're excited to pick back up after a week off due to some travel and COVID scares, and ready to jump into another episode.
Yes, good to be here.
Yes, and for everybody wondering, I'm COVID-free.
Yeah.
No COVID.
I was going to let you say it.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. So really excited about the opportunity to have the conversation that we're going to have today as we spend some time in our deep dive talking about something that we covered on I think it was episode 8, where we talked about personal growth as a leader. But we talked briefly about the sort of second chair and that idea of leading from not the lead leadership seat in an organization. So we're going to spend some time talking about there as we kind of live in that tension on a daily basis. And so that'll be where we spend our deep dive. But before we do that, we'll spend a little time in the shallow end with the favorite, of everyone, Would You Rather?
Oh, yeah.
And so I'll start with this one. It's easy, maybe. But would you rather have constantly dry eyes or a constant runny nose?
Oh, man. That is hard because I'm a contact wearer. And so dry eyes, I feel the pain. It's like death by 1,000 cuts in your eyes. Sorry for that visual. That's like really dramatic.
Yeah.
I just took it and escalated it to a very extreme point. I think I would rather have dry eyes though, because I could put drops in my eyes.
Yes.
But I don't want to be the person walking around with a constantly runny nose. That's really gross.
No. And your nose would be raw all the time from
man,
like wiping it and blowing it.
Then you're like Vaseline nose.
Yeah.
It's just
No. Although those Vicks tissues are pretty good.
Yeah.
But I feel like they'd lose their pizzazz after
like
a
the
day.
10th one. Yeah. It's not like the commercial where it's the little animal who's like instantly comforted by using a Kleenex.
Not at all. Not at all. Yeah, I'm definitely dry eyes. You can always add who was the guy who from Ferris Bueller who did the dry eyes commercials? Ben Stein.
Yeah, Ben Stein.
Yeah, it's like clear eyes. You can always add some clear eyes to your dry eyes. So yeah.
That's good. Okay, I have one. This is a deep one.
Okay.
Would you, if you had to pick one that you could do, or like one ability for the rest of your life, would you rather be able to read or to listen to music?
Oh. This is cruel.
I know.
I mean, oh man.
Not play music. So I don't know. I didn't factor that part in. Because I'm not a musical person. So
it's like when you say read, you mean read books.
Yeah, like would you be able to read?
Not like read music.
If you could never do one or the other, would you rather be able to never read books again or never listen or hear music?
Oh my gosh. I think I'm going to say I would want to be able to read books. But man, that would be a boring existence with no music. That I'm gonna go with I want to read books, so I'll say no music, but that like pains my soul.
Yeah, I don't know that I could choose. That's why I'm asking the question. Maybe just all of your books would need to be. You could be into musicals.
No, I see. That's where I'm at. Like on musicals where there's unnecessary singing, where there could be dialogue. Like Les Mis when it came out, as a movie a while ago. I was like, I don't need to know that you're tying your shoes by you singing it. Like, you can just say, I'm tying my shoes right now, or I want to go to the store. Like, I'm not going to sing because nobody wants to hear that, but it does not. Like, every nuance of the dialogue doesn't need to be sung, which is apparently probably why I would not be a fan of Hamilton.
Yeah, you would struggle in that.
But, to each their own. Would you rather wear a wedding dress every day or a bathing suit every day?
Oh man, I feel like that limits you from going places regardless of what you're wearing. I'm going to say wedding dress because I feel like, unless you're going to put parameters around this, wedding dresses have evolved, and I feel like it would be easier. I'd rather be the girl wearing like just a slightly overly dressed white dress. Like I may not have to wear a gown, but it's hard to make a bathing suit true clothing.
Oh, yeah.
Unless we're going to like 1800s, like women's literal bathing garb, which I think is not what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I don't know. I hadn't thought that deeply about it. I just saw it on the internet and I was like, oh, that's a good one.
Again, I took it from 0 to
yeah.
60. And
Yeah,
like
the bathing suit thing is tricky unless you live at the beach. And then it's kind of like, well,
that's true.
It's more socially acceptable.
That's true.
I mean, but still, at some point, like, I don't want to go to Publix, I mean, I'm not. I think like the male equivalent would be like a tuxedo, not not a wedding dress.
That would be the weirdest
and
of
it's
all.
like, yeah, it's like me, like at Circle K, getting a Polar Pop in a tuxedo feels a little out of place, but
hey,
it's not the worst.
yeah, maybe you just had to stop for a Polar Pop.
You never know. You
Anyway.
never know. You need to stay hydrated. It's
Yeah.
important.
Okay, this one is kind of gross. Would you rather, okay, we're talking about entrances, making an entrance or making an exit. Would you rather everywhere that you like entered, a store, your home, wherever you are, when you step inside, you have to stop and lick the floor? Or would you, and you can't give disclaimers, you can't be like, I'm the guy who has to lick the floor. You just have to do it. Or when you leave a place, would you rather have to get in your car and honk 10 times before departing?
That's not even close. I would so much rather honk 10 times. And I don't care if they're like 20-second honks, although that would be inconvenient.
That would be awful.
The idea of licking. So I was in Panama City like not that long ago, and I needed just a nightlight for our son, and I went into a Dollar Tree, and the thought of that's the first floor that came to mind.
Dollar Tree's not exempt.
Not licking the floor. Like, I'm honking 10 times for sure. I don't care if people look.
There you go.
Yeah. Where are you honking or licking the floor?
I think I would be honking. I mean, licking the floor feels like efficient because you could just get down there real quick and just get it over with. Depending on where you are, maybe like somebody wouldn't even notice, you just like find a little corner and lick the floor real quick. But it is disgusting.
That's making my skin crawl.
I would be disgusted with myself. And so I don't think I could live.
I struggle with like the 5-second rule. I'm not immune but like usually I'm like, it's like, oh, that food fell on the floor. That's lost. We're just going to leave that.
It also depends on where you are with that too.
Yeah. Yeah, but even in my house, I'm still kind of like,
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
It depends.
Yeah. I'm so grossed out.
You're welcome.
Well, on that, we'll transition to our deep dive where we talk about really second chair leadership and what it looks like to be a leader who's not in that leadership seat. And so one of the things we'll just kind of quickly start out with, and this is from the book, The Second Chair, or Leading from the Second Chair by Mike Bonham and Roger Patterson. I think this is a helpful definition of what a second chair leader is. It says, a second chair leader is a person in a subordinate role whose influence with others adds value throughout the organization. And so it says second chair leadership is unique because it's not strictly based on the power and authority of positional leadership. So obviously as the first chair leader, like everybody knows you are, like the buck stops with you, you are the leader, you can, not that it's always effective, but you can make decrees and people can follow. But as a second chair leader, you don't have that positional authority. Many do have positional authority, but a lot of success in second chair leadership and first chair leadership, but especially in second chair leadership, comes through influence and relationships both up and down the organization. And so as we frame this conversation, we don't want to make people think that you have to be the number 2 person in an organization. That's the roles that we fill personally, but that's not necessarily what that has to be. It can be anyone who's not the lead leader. And so in any position, you can be a sandwich artist at Subway. I believe they were called. And which Subway, that's a whole nother story for another time. No, thank you. But you can still be a second chair leader by even though your positional authority is not very high. And I don't know why that was the example that came to mind, but
I mean, Subway inspires.
Whatever. So yeah, as we think about that, Ashlyn, maybe first, could you just talk about the role of second chair leadership and how that fleshes out for you, and then we can dive into some more conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think you made a good point that leading from the second chair doesn't have to mean that you are the sort of second highest on the organization chart. That it can be, because organizations are all structured differently, and I mean, especially churches, you're more than an organization, and so but if we're speaking kind of in those terms, I think some of the main responsibilities of a second chair leader, I mean, and you kind of hinted to this, like building strong relationships, sort of stewarding your influence, and you're kind of occupying that middle space between the leader of the organization or the company or whatever it is. If in a church, on a staff, it's probably your pastor or the elders, however, depending on what your structure looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And, and then sort of being a liaison and to the rest of the staff. But I think you're also still occupying, I think it's easy to think about a second chair leader as solely a manager, but I do think that it is more than that. And especially if you are in a place where maybe you are functionally a second chair leader, but you're not managing a lot of other people, sometimes that, I'm specifically thinking about even a church plant. There's obviously, depending on what some of those secondary roles are, support roles are, may or may not be, pastors, but you may not be, managing a huge team, but you still have a lot of second chair responsibilities. So just trying to like pick out some of those nuances that their second chair roles can look really different. For me personally, and I mean, you were obviously co-executive directors, just overseeing specifically different ministries within our church. I oversee our next gen family ministries, so kids, youth, and college ministry, communications, kind of creative work, and then what else do I do? We don't have like a missions person, so sending efforts
all falls under you.
Yeah, that all falls under. And so I mean, that is a lot of management, but it is also a lot of strategic thinking and trying to kind of exert influence over the whole staff,
Mm-hmm.
in line with the big picture of what Dean and the elders are kind of guiding, what the way that they're giving direction and guidance. So that was a lot of rambling.
Yeah, no, I think that was really helpful in thinking through just kind of different, especially in the church, different avenues or ways that people can lead, and then kind of the view into the way that we work. And yeah, so I mean, where I sit organizationally, like, is kind of next to you as a peer. We are subordinate to Dean and to the elders, and then we help lead our staff and ministry directors. And so I work with a lot of our Sunday morning teams, our kind of HR, finance, admin type of stuff, as well as our discipleship ministries. And so we get to manage those relationships where, as second chair leaders, we have the unique position of being under and in submission to. And I think, like, as Christians, there's a temptation maybe to think of like the fact that there's the whole idea of just submission and leadership. Like, we're all submissive to Christ, who's kind of king of all. And so submission in leadership is actually a pretty Christian posture. Jesus models that, and so it's not a weird thing for a Christian to be a second chair leader. It's not a bad thing. Like, there is going to be submission to authority, and so we get to sit under the authority that the Lord has placed over us. But then also we get the opportunity to manage the relationships of the team we lead. And so I think there's a challenge and an opportunity in leading up and down the organization. And so we, as a second chair leader, you have to really work on the relationships of those you're leading. Obviously, that's crucial, but the most important relationship that we may have to nurture is with the person who's leading us. And in this case, it's, in our case, it's Dean. And just kind of, I think one of the things that's made us work well together, the three of us, is that we have a great relationship in terms of just working relationship. Like, we've done a good job of making sure that there's clear communication and clear lines of authority, and but also, like, we like each other. We're
Right,
friends.
just friendship, yeah.
And so there's a lot of trust built because we know that, we care for one another as people as much or more than we do, kind of layer the organizational side on that. And so managing relationships to me is one of the key pieces, and also the most difficult tensions of second chair leadership, because you've got to help the first chair leader, kind of see their vision come to life. And that takes managing people, as we talked about last time in that, kind of that growth as a leader it's all about relationship. And so, but at the same time, we've got to lead up to Dean and to help him see things that, maybe he doesn't see, or to kind of make him aware of things so he's not surprised by stuff or whatever. And so that tension of managing the relationship up and down, I think, is one of the biggest opportunities and challenges of second chair leadership.
Yeah, and I think that as Christians, we sort of have an interesting and a good opportunity to try to manage those relationships in a different way. I mean, we could do a whole deep dive into Christian friendship, but but as it functions in friendship between superiors and subordinates and working roles within an organization, I think that as a Christian, because our ultimate loyalty is to Christ as the head of the church, that also helps you to kind of protect yourself against blind loyalty or putting someone on a pedestal because they're, when you add the sort of layer of friendship, because if we look at how a lot of organizations and teams and things structure in or operate in worldly, structures and spheres, or secular companies or whatever, a lot of people have the attitude of just these are the people that I work with. I see them every day, but we're not friends, or, I go home and whatever. And that's a whole nother, there's lots of, missional opportunity there. But anyways, absolutely. That's a different conversation for a different day. And if you're not a Christian, that, you're not thinking that way. But when you are friends with the people that you work with and you care about them and you, day in and day out, you're really working hard together, that does change your working relationships. And so, but I think that as Christians, we can receive that as a gift and actually help it, fuel working well together. And as a second cheerleader, like you said, really wanting to serve the first cheerleader. And sometimes that means, carrying out what they, what they have in mind and just trying to do really good work. And other times it means, like you said, supporting them by pointing things out or by helping them to see other things happening in the organization. So I just think that as Christians, because our allegiance is to Christ, then we're able to enjoy the friendship with one another. And that actually, I think in a lot of ways can help the working dynamics rather than, muddying it or, some people might say, well, that's too much. You don't want to be close friends with the people that you work with because that's just a lot of layers, but you're also, I think, protected in that because it's well, I'm not going to be blindly loyal to someone to the point where we, maybe we see in secular settings where that, all of a sudden begins to corrupt your integrity or, you're I don't care what this person does. I'm going to support them because I have selfish ambition. They're going to help me get where I want to go. I just think that that's what I'm so grateful for within the church, that we are protected from those things. Not that you're immune to them because we know that happens, but I think that's the opportunity that Christians have to really say, how can friendship actually fuel the work that you're doing as leaders at different levels?
Well, I think that's really important too in the context of disagreement, and where, maybe as a second chair leader, you maybe disagree with the directive or the kind of vision, and obviously I'm not talking about massive disagreements, these kind of major convictional things, but just you would make a different call if you were in that seat, which is fine and normal. But I think at some point you have to say, like, would I rather ruin the relationship to be what I view as right, or am I going to, as out of reverence for, the positional authority that person has over me, and also the fact that, like, I am their friend, and and again, we're also assuming this is not some kind of like going off of a cliff terrible decision that they're about to make, where you should, in the right way and through the appropriate channels, step in and speak into that. But to say, what, like, the relationship and the friendship is far more valuable, and like there's not, this maybe isn't the decision I would make, but there's nothing wrong with that decision inherently, other than I disagree with it for these reasons. But if that's been said, like, the relationship and the friendship and the allegiance ultimately to Christ and submission to the authority that he's put over us, like, it allows you to operate in that friendship arena and to say, like, this is so much bigger than just, I disagree with this leadership decision, which is easier to do, I think, sometimes in the non-Christian arenas of leadership, because you don't see it as maybe primarily a brother or sister in Christ making that decision first, but you see it as this person, because they make it just for whatever reason, they made a decision that you don't like, and so therefore they're a terrible person and you don't want to submit to them. And even though you have to, like, you're going to go talk to your 5 coworkers about how terrible it is, and that just, like, undermines everything that they're trying to do, and ultimately I think everything you're trying to do, because you're now showing the people that are either beside you or beneath you organizationally that on the org chart that like you don't have the leaders back. And so as second chair leaders, we can nurture those relationships and realize that friendship and that relationship, and I think that's been really helpful for us, is that we don't agree on everything. We have a unified front though, and so when we have the the appropriate places to have those conversations, and we do, oftentimes at a booth in Chick-fil-A, and so, but we've realized that the trust that we have with Dean, that he's given us, really, and also the relationship that we've nurtured with him, is far more valuable oftentimes than us just being right. And
I think that can be a challenge that second chair leaders can face, is that, if you're not careful, it's easy to begin to think, because you sort of sit in this unique position where you're in a lot of ways closer to the day in and day out workings of the of the ministry. You just have a different perspective, especially to the staff and sort of the operational life of the church. You might be a little closer to that than the first chair leader, and I'm saying that because I'm sort of trying to speak beyond just, a senior pastor. This might be in whatever type of work setting. So obviously I want to acknowledge that in a church that typically is going to be your senior pastor, but I'm going to use more organizational terms, assuming that we're speaking beyond that. It can be easy as a second cheerleader, I think, to fall into the trap of, well, I see how all of this goes day in and day out. And then to sort of, let pride creep in and say, well, I know better, I have a better perspective on this decision than you do. And that becomes just a dangerous place, because I think when, as a second cheerleader, what is helpful, I think, is if you struggle with that, to sort of then push that down one step further and say, okay, what if I had a director coming to me saying, I actually know better how to make this decision than you do, because I am seeing. Now, there are definitely times where, like, part of leadership is extending, like, entrusting your, what am I trying to say? Trusting your team and sort of stewarding your influence to say, okay, this director that I'm supervising or that I'm managing, I trust them to speak the truth to me of what's happening in their sphere. And in some ways that person is kind of they need to be a huge part of the decision-making process.
Mm-hmm.
But there are things that you above them see because you have a higher view of the organization. And so I think that can be something difficult, that a second chair leader has so much of that oversight. You know, it's not isolated to one ministry area or to one, if you're working in a different organization, to one department or one team. You tend to see it all, but you also don't sit in that first chair. And so you are thinking about things in a different way. And so I just think that's maybe a unique experience of the second chair leader, is that you have almost as high of a view as the first chair leader, in the sense that you are not isolated to one, to one specific department, but you're also thinking about things in a different way. And so there just has to be so much trust, and I think mutual trust and appreciation for one another, to be able to make decisions well, because the second cheerleader can't be thinking, well, because I'm closer to everything, I know what's best, because at the end of the day, you're not in the first chair and you are looking at things differently than, sometimes it's really helpful to have the first cheerleader be a little more removed even than you are, because they can kind of look, they might be at the 30,000 foot view when you're at the 15,000 foot view. And so just remembering that wherever you are, you have a different perspective. And very functionally at the end of the day, the person in the first chair has been entrusted to make those big, decisions. And as a second chair leader, sometimes you have to be okay with saying, in the same way that people below you push things up and say, I've communicated what I know. I can give Dean, to his credit, is very good at letting us speak into things. And it's not just, well, here's my report. It's really valuing like our voices. Sometimes you have to let yourself be heard, but then you also have to say, okay, this isn't my call. And that's part of being in this chair. And a lot of times that's, thank goodness.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that you were talking about really in that is this idea of having sort of both a deep understanding of maybe specific ministry areas, or in our context, or, areas within the organization, but also being able to kind of pull up and see the wider picture. And so this sort of tension of deep and wide kind of views of the organization. And I really think, and that's true at every level of leadership, but for second chair leaders who are really going to help, exert influence and create good across the organization, we have to be able to do that. We have to be really good at what we've been tasked with doing, while also being able to kind of look up and see and realize that because of, like you said, where people sit within the organization, we do see things differently. And so, even, like a volunteer can do that really well in a ministry area where they may be the best sound guy, kind of in a deep sense, but they can help the leader of, the music and production ministries by being able to see the whole picture and catch things before they come up and say, okay, like I'm really good at this thing, but also I'm seeing these things as I look up and I notice, hey, we're missing this, or we could be better here, or hey, have you thought about blank, and then also trusting the leader that's over them to then take that information and do with it what they need to. And so that's something that I think, as regardless of where you sit organizationally, but really, especially for us, we have to be able to do that. Like, we have to be able to see the minutia at times, and the nitty-gritty of certain things, while also being able to look at the whole organization and go, okay, yes, your ministry area sees this, this thing or this initiative as a key, and I can totally understand how you would think that that's the biggest issue right now. But as we look across the whole organization, that is an issue, but it is not nearly as big as this issue and this issue. And so, like, I hear you, I've received that information. I want you to know that, it's valuable. At the same time, based on what I see, or what, Dean sees, or whoever, like somebody over that person, we're not going to run with that initiative right now, or we're going to put more energy towards this thing. And those people have to have, I mean, we have to have the trust with them that they know that we've listened and received it, and at the same time that they, have the trust that we're making the right call based on what we can see.
Yeah.
And I think that's true, like for us with Dean, and our first year leader. He sees things differently. And so, like you said, that's a blessing to us in a lot of ways, because we don't carry all of the pressure that comes with that first chair.
Right.
And so to say, hey, here's things that I see, here's things that are bubbling up, here's things that I think you need to be aware of. And then for us to trust him and to say, hey, you know what, you have all the information that you need to make the decision that you need to, and then we're going to trust that and run with it. What are some things that you think could be beneficial for, maybe there's somebody who's in a new working relationship, or maybe kind of a line was crossed where trust was broken? What are some ways for first and second chair leaders to build trust with one another?
That's good. I mean, I think that trust is built over time, and so I think that there does have to be ongoing examples of just integrity and working well together. Like there is something to be said for, I know that this person will get the job done, will be a person that I can respect, that they're who they say that they are, their words match their life, and so I think a lot of it has to come from just like living that out and building trust over time. I think that first cheerleaders can gain a lot of ground with second cheerleaders by really listening to them, because you have put these people in these roles for a reason, and you are really stewarding your influence through them. And so, I mean, and we see lots of examples of that in scripture too, that being an ally or a helper is not just sharing some of the load. It's also kind of expanding the reach of ministry through another person. And so I think by really entrusting your second chair leaders and by listening to them and giving them a voice, I think that can go a long way. And I also think too that you can build trust with them by really thinking about their role, so sometimes it's easy to, like, I think about in the past when I have wanted to hand something off to someone, and I kind of want to just say, okay, go forth and conquer, and don't bother me with it anymore. That's like the approach that we want to take to delegation.
You're the leader now. I don't have anything to do with this.
Right. But I think by, it's almost like you're kind of sending people out, but you're always still attached to them. It's just that your rope gets, it might get more slack in it, and they might get further and further from you, but you're still attached to it. So I think first cheerleaders can, just keep in mind that they have to continue to think about the role of their second cheerleaders and manage them. And then I think second cheerleaders can develop trust with their first cheerleaders just by by trying to work well, to do a good job, to be someone who is trustworthy, to carry out, the work that they've been given, and to not say, well, that's what you told me to do, but I care about X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to, kind of try to build my own kingdom over here. I think that can erode a lot of trust if it becomes about you and your platform. So, I think just remembering that all of the lines in an organization, to me, are not just for, clarity or for to support hierarchy, but they're lines between people. And so I think that when you look at those as actually connection points, that really changes the way that you think about leadership structures.
Yeah, no, that's good. One of the things that I think you're kind of hitting on just there at the end that I've thought about, somewhat regularly, and as we were preparing for this podcast, that came to mind was oftentimes either the person in the second chair can view that role as like a stepping stone, and it's like, okay, I've got to do this, and then I've got to be a ministry staff member, and then I've got to be a ministry director, and then I've got to be, a campus pastor, and then one day I'll be a lead pastor. I'll be in the first chair, and then I'll get to make all the decisions and have all the authority, or fill in any roles in any organization. I mean, to go back to Subway, it could be the sandwich artist to the assistant manager to the store manager to the regional manager to the assistant, to the regional manager, whatever. So. And I don't want it to sound bad, because there is a leadership development and process that people can go through. But as you're in a second chair, there is a tension between contentment in the role that you're in, as well as understanding that you may have a desire for more leadership than you're given in a current organization. So how can second chair leaders manage that tension of contentment and also sort of dreaming of what leadership could be down the road?
I mean, gosh, that is probably different for every person. I imagine that some people, like, there's kind of this, and I've seen this because I've worked for, now almost 10 years in like full-time church ministry. But before that, I was working in, I was way down the food chain in secular workplaces. And so I have seen this play out just and like through friends, like just in a variety of different settings. Sometimes people are like afraid to talk about like what they want in the future. And so all of a sudden it becomes like, I have to quietly like plot out my trajectory, and I think maybe that's where some of the stepping stone stuff comes from. Whereas if you could just say, hey, here's how long I envision myself being in this role, that could change, that, the Lord could do something different, but here's kind of my end. Here's where I sense myself moving towards, pending that I'm not directed elsewhere. Like sometimes I think those things just need to be said, and we're afraid of like, I don't know if it's like if someone on your team comes to you and is like, hey, here's kind of my, the plan that I, have in my heart. Obviously the Lord could direct elsewhere, but and here's kind of where I want to end up. If we're too afraid to let that person go beyond where they are, that's not stewarding their gifts well, or stewarding our leadership well. So I think as a second chair leader, if that's you, I think that you have to think about that and be honest about that. Like, I think we have to have those conversations to say, like, what does life look like in 10 years? Obviously, if 2020 has taught us anything, it's like, we got no idea. But, where do you see yourself moving towards? What are you really, passionate about? What kind of work do you want to be doing? And nurture that, and be, if we're as excited about sending people out from our church in a missional sense, we also need to be excited about sending people on in those work settings. But as a second cheerleader, I think you also have to be forthcoming with that, and you can't say, well, I love this role, I'm great where I am, and then over here on the side be like trying to work on something else. Like, just, I think transparency, and that's hard because I think we're afraid of like the people dynamics thing, I guess. I don't know, and I'm probably that's a little hard for me to think about as like a woman in a church setting, because like I'm not thinking about one day when I move up into the number one role, that's just not something I'm thinking about. So that's unique. But so I don't know. I mean, I'd be curious to know how you would answer that.
Yeah. So I think, honestly, the first thing that comes to mind is self-awareness and knowing what your gift set and strengths are, because there are certain people, and I think at least at this point in my life, I would put myself in this category. Like, I don't see myself in a non-second chair role. I think I said that right. Like, I only see myself in second chair roles at this point. Like, I don't think I have the skill set that would be, ideal to be a lead pastor if I was going to, stay in church world. So, I think it starts with that, knowing, and sometimes you got to figure that out. Like, sometimes you got to go and you got to fail, and you've got to be a first chair leader somewhere. And then you realize, like, this isn't for me. The flip side is to, I think, also to understand that there are seasons of leadership. And I think that's true, that and that's something that first chair leaders need to understand, and second chair leaders need to understand. And so, like there's a desire, and especially like for us, I think our staff is so relational, so just like friendly. Like we're all friends as, as much as we are coworkers and peers and bosses and subordinates and things like that. That like there are seasons to leadership. And so while we want people to be here, sort of selfishly forever, that's not realistic. And so it's okay if somebody comes in and says, hey, I'm going to fill this role for, kind of like you were talking about, for this season of time. I'm going to make a commitment, and then I'm going to carry it out. And then I'm going to go on to something else because I feel like the Lord is calling me something. Like that's totally fine, and we need to be okay with that. And I mean, the church world and hiring is just sort of strange oftentimes about that stuff anyways. And there's like a secrecy to moving and moving up and communicating that, I think transparency is such a key there. And so to steward that well, I think like as a second chair leader, you do need to be transparent and say, hey, I have a desire over, maybe like you said, maybe it's 10 years from now, I have a desire to fill X role or, be a first chair leader. How can I be faithful where I am now and in the roles that may be in between there, while also working with, the first chair leader to see me develop into that, and then also like just be really content where you are and manage that tension, and then for the first chair leader to go, you know what, it's actually a good thing for this kind of subordinate role to the person in there to have a desire to grow into, more levels of leadership. And if we can keep them, in high levels of leadership in our organization, let's do that. But if we can't, like there's only going to be one lead pastor. And so if this person really wants to be a lead pastor, let them like bless them and send them to go lead well. And so that's a tension to be managed, and there's a right way to do that and there's a wrong way to do that. And I think that's oftentimes too an issue. People don't handle that well. They either exit the door too early, or they leave poorly, or whatever the case may be. And they're, but understanding that. And so, but I think really it's kind of communication and clarity, and being okay with seasons, and then also understanding who you are as a leader and what roles that you would or wouldn't be kind of best at or most apt to fill.
And I imagine, if I can just say one more thing, I imagine that there might be people who over time have moved, like, because I think because it's helpful sometimes to use these sort of like organizational structures and things that within the church, that we can easily start to think like a corporation, and in a lot of corporations and businesses, like the goal is to sort of like just not like drift to the top, but like the natural thing is, if you've okay, Alex, if you've been in the sales role for 5 years, okay, well now let's talk about moving you up to a sales manager. And I think a common thing that happens for some people is that you were really great at being a salesperson because that's what you're made to do, that's what you love to do, and then now we've taken you and moved you to a sales manager role and you're miserable because that's a totally different role. And so I think that's where I think we have to be. The church is a great place to be creative in how you staff and how you structure people. Because if you're a second chair leader who has like recently moved up into that role and you're struggling, and like I said, that doesn't necessarily, I mean, it doesn't have to be like, I'm not necessarily talking about an executive director, executive pastor, that whatever your second chair person is. I mean, because we talked about that early on, how wherever you are in that position where you're still stewarding kind of your influence and leadership over the whole organization, whatever that role looks like for you, that's okay also to say, it's so countercultural in our world to say, like, we would look at that as like, I'm going to step back down into a lower echelon of the organization or something like that. And that's where I think the beauty of creative staffing can really come in handy, because if you are thinking more about the people, then that's going to do better for your organization in the long term. And so if you're a second chair leader who has sort of moved up into a management role, and you're really struggling with that, or saying like, I don't know, maybe I'm not, maybe I liked being over here doing this other stuff, like that, I think that's where we can say, I mean, we have to listen to all of our people, in that, not that our goal is to create, ideal roles for people, but I just think that's an interesting piece of it too, that we don't always have to think in terms, to your point, whatever sort of your end goal is, whatever you want to be developed towards professionally and vocationally, it doesn't always have to follow the same stepping stones that we, sometimes because we've absorbed sort of like just the worldly business structures that we sort of tend to think in. So.
Yeah. And I think, oftentimes like the world says that our identity is in our role. Yeah. And so there is that desire to escalate. And, you just think about, and even in the church, this is normal, but it's like, hey, I'm so-and-so and I do blank, it's like, it's so often our work, we're like so tied to our work. And so there's a desire for status and for, just the appearance and pride and ego to want to move up into a role. And so like, yeah, sales may be the best place for somebody, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Because our identity ultimately isn't in whether we're a salesperson or a sales manager or a ministry director or an executive director or a lead pastor or an associate pastor. Like we need people at all levels of the organization, and we need people who can thrive and do that well. And so to remember our identity in Christ first, like that is where as Christians we place our identity, our primary and in some ways I want to say our only identity. I don't know if I think I agree with that statement.
Yeah.
But like obviously we have other identifiers, but like we should find our identity in Christ, not in our role. And so it's okay if you try, if you're a second chair leader and you try and you move to a first chair role and you don't succeed.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Because your identity is in Christ.
Right.
If you move up from, a second chair role to a different second chair role and then you move back down. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is it embarrassing in a worldly sense? Maybe. But if you're in the right spot doing something that you love, your ministry is fruitful, and you're there's fulfillment in that, and your identity's in Christ. Who cares?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. And so I think sometimes being able to say that and just take the pressure off and to realize like we want people to aspire to more leadership. We want people to aspire to grow in their craft and in their skills. That's a good thing. Like I want to see more leaders developed. I want to see more Christian leaders developed because I think they're going to be the best leaders that, exist because of the way that the Christian worldview shapes leadership.
Yeah, that's good.
But not everybody is called to lead a ton of people.
Right.
They may just be leading themselves and their family. And so it's like, how do we equip them to do the best that they can, but also be the best, second chair leader that they can be, even if they're not leading, a large portion of the organization. What are some things that you would tell first chair leaders about second chair leadership?
Ooh.
Mute this part of the podcast. Team.
Yeah. Tell first cheerleaders about second cheerleaders. I think I would say that, oh man, this is tough. I mean, I think I would say that, so I hear from a lot of first cheerleaders that, it's the first chair is a really lonely place. I would say that's true of second cheerleaders too. It's different. I get that's different. And I'm so grateful that like we are executive directoring.
Yes. Cause
I'm like, man, if I had to do this by myself, I would be in a corner somewhere crying. But I think that can be, second chair leadership can also be lonely in some ways because you're trying to lead up well, and that's a difficult dynamic in and of itself, but you also are, up above the rest of the organization. And, you really, because so much of your day-to-day work is managing people and maintaining relationships, that can be just difficult, because you want to care for each person and be friends with each person. We're human. We want people to like us, and you also have to be the person who, is part of making really difficult decisions. And so I think that second chair leadership, even though it is, we can kind of make jokes that like second chair is the sweetest place to be because you get, you sort of get the high view, but you don't have to, the buck doesn't stop with you. I do think that there still can be a lot of just loneliness and difficulty in sitting in that seat. So I think that's something that first cheerleaders should be attuned to. That's the first one comes to mind. What would you say? I want to think on that a little more.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things to me, and I'm thankful that this doesn't happen in our, to me, in a lot of ways, but I think there may be sometimes where it's easy to do this, and I think even like we have to be careful in the way that we lead others to not do this, but don't make your second chair leader like your middleman for hard things, for hard outs. There are times where we need to do that. Like there are definitely things, like there are arrows that a first chair does not need to take that a second chair can step in and take. And so by no means am I saying, second chair leaders are devoid from difficult conversations or but sometimes there are things that and it's not even always like difficult or hard things, but sometimes I think there are things that just need to come from the top. And so and it's I think it's a responsibility of us to be able to, if we're delegated something, to say, hey, I think that needs to come from you. I think you need to say that. If you don't want to, I will. That's I think a responsibility of our role, but at the same time, that it can't be all delegated in that way. And so that's a tension. I think if we've talked about anything, most second chair leadership is attention.
Managing tensions,
and so, but the second chair leader isn't the scapegoat for tough conversations and tough decisions all the time. But with some of your leadership comes tough decisions and tough conversations. And so just knowing that, I'm thankful, like Dean really doesn't put me in that situation. But that's just something that, like, either from talking to other people or, that I think sometimes I feel a temptation to be like, well, you need to just go have this tough conversation because it's like your thing. And I mean, I'm just going to provide input, but it's like, no, really, I need to go do that. And I don't need to skirt the responsibility of that. And so I think that would just be something that comes to mind in that. I think the other thing is, to your point, we often hear that first chair leadership is lonely. I want first chair leaders to know their second chair has their back. I know there's exceptions and there's failures and there's times where trust is broken, but like, man, 99 times out of 100, or probably more than that, like the people in the second chair have your back. They believe in you. And so it might be lonely. We don't know what the first chair is like, but we care about you enough, and we have your back, that we want to know as much as we can, and we want to support you and serve you in as much as we can. And so I would say maybe don't make it lonelier than it needs to be, because you have people around you who want to carry your vision forward, who want to see that carried out, who want to support you, who want to do the difficult work of ministry with you and co-labor with you. And so let those people hold up your arms and walk with you, and not feel like you have to just be at the top alone. In that, I think would be just an encouragement that I would give to first chair leaders, that like we want to carry as much as we can. And I know that we can't carry it all, but because there's just unique positions, there are unique priorities that come with that position. But we want to serve, maybe more than they think. Yeah.
I think that's good. I mean, if anything, I think that between first and second cheerleaders, and this is something we can all learn, is that leadership doesn't need to be as lonely as we can tend to sometimes make it. And I just saw on, I can't remember who posted it, but I saw a post on Instagram of all places the other day. But it was the letter that President George Bush left to President Clinton when in their transfer of power. And if you read it, one of the things he says, I didn't find it as lonely as other people have made it out or have said that it was. And I don't know why that line stood out to me, but I think and I don't know why. I would love to hear him unpack that as to why, but I imagine that it has to do with having people around you, and everybody's personality is different. And so I think, especially if you are a first cheerleader who tends to, to pull back or to isolate or to feel like you're a one-man team or whatever, I I echo everything you said, that I think you're part of trusting your second cheerleader is also trusting that when they say, hey, like it's okay for us to move forward, or it's okay to do X, Y, and Z, or like, like feed off of their energy too. Don't just say, okay, well, that's them speaking from where they are, but from where I am, here's what, yes, you have a different perspective, but also if you have extended your leadership and influence to people that you trust, then you know that like what they're speaking, like there's you in that, you know what I mean? Like there's your influence in that. And so you can trust them to help you move things forward.
Yeah, that's good. I think that is a great place to leave this conversation. If you have more thoughts, we'd love to hear them on either Twitter or Instagram. You can follow us at the Local Dive Pod. As we wrap up this episode with the Local on Tap, we're going to transition to weird things in Tallahassee. And so I was driving the other day, and this popped to mind because if you've ever driven down Centerville Road, kind of, I guess, I don't know, that would be east of Capitol Circle.
Yeah.
There is the most random yard art, I guess we'll call it. There's like a giant blue whale or multiple blue whales coming out of this person's front yard with some dolphin statues and a giant American flag.
I want to know what the underground situation looks like there.
Yeah.
Like,
there had to be some reinforcement.
These installed?
Like, yeah, these are like, if you've never seen it, 12, 15 feet tall, some of the pieces.
Yeah.
And like, I'm tempted to stop and just go, what's the deal with the whales? Like, are you passionate about sea life and conservation, or is there did you just buy the house and inherit them and like not know how to get rid of them? Like, I don't know.
It's like it was like a water park that then like died out, and then somebody like built a house around it.
Yes. It's it's one of the weirdest things, but I mean, I kind of get a kick out of it every time I drive by it. So I don't really want it to go away. I'm just like, I don't know what's going on. That is so bizarre.
So my weird thing also has to kind of do with like, I don't know, like nature accents, I guess. But Tallahassee, I have noticed, this isn't like isolated to one specific place, but Tallahassee, we're big on you know how you can buy the little faces to put on the trees?
Yes.
It's like they look like the trees are looking at you. We're big on that. We like that as a city. So like I'll walk my dog through not Dorothy Oven Park, McCord Park off of Armistead, and there's like several trees that have those. And then, I mean, obviously if you're going to go to like Tallahassee Nurseries or like a nursery, it's like, they're going to have like it. Some people like the whimsical garden things, but I've been walking through the greenways before on trails. And then all of a sudden you look over and you're like, that tree has a face. No. And it is just concerning to me.
Yeah, no, that's creepy.
So I like fun, certain, as a homeowner, it's like I'm getting more into like the gardening elements, but like that's taking whimsy maybe a little too far.
Yeah, it makes me think of Legends of the Hidden Temple. So if you were like a child of the 90s and watched Nickelodeon, it was like the Enchanted Forest or something, and you had to like reach in and get the coin or whatever from the trees.
Come out and grab you.
Yes, and like some of the trees moved. Like that's just what I think of when I see those. And actually, Melissa and I's first date was at Brewster's on Tharp in the corner of Tharp and High. And we sat outside for like an hour and a half, and there was one of those staring at us the whole time. And I was like, this is so weird. And it still sticks, like it's still stuck in my head.
It's like no one wants to be in a good moment. And then you're like, that tree is looking at me.
Yes.
Like, it's just not okay.
That is very, very bizarre. So if you have any weird Tallahassee landmarks, let us know. We would love to know what other just strange things are out there in the city that we love. So thanks for listening to another episode of The Local Dive. We'll catch you next week.
Thanks for listening to The Local Dive, a podcast diving into deep and shallow musings about Christ, the church, and culture. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. You can follow The Local Dive on social media and continue the conversation with us on Instagram and Twitter at The Local Dive Pod.